On the evening of 21st of January 1525, less than 8 years after the start of the Protestant Reformation, a small group of Christians were meeting secretly in a house in Zurich to talk and pray together. They'd been enthusiastic followers of Ulrich Zwingli, minister of the Grossmünster, the main church in the city, who was attempting to reform both the church and the city of Zurich. They'd studied the Bible with him, listened attentively to his sermons, shared his convictions and supported his reform programme. But they were now deeply troubled by his apparent reluctance to follow through on what he had been preaching and to implement what they regarded as clear biblical teaching on a number of issues, including the baptism of believers rather than infants. Zwingli was committed to a citywide reformation which needed the support of the city council. It was his task, he believed, to advocate reformation on the basis of Scripture, but the council must decide how and when to implement these reforms. Zwingli refused to press too hard or move too quickly and risk alienating the civic authorities. But some of his followers were not prepared to move at such a slow pace and were not convinced that reform needed to be authorised by the authorities. Over the past 2 years they had agitated for faster and more radical action. The City Council had organised public debates to examine the arguments and had, not surprisingly, backed the more gradual programme proposed by Zwingli. But the radicals were not satisfied and were becoming convinced that they faced a choice between obeying the City Council or obeying God. The meeting on 21st January was the culmination of many months of Bible study and discussion, during which time the issue of baptism had come to the fore. Some of those present had already risked punishment by refusing to baptize their children, but they were now considering a more radical step. The Bible, they believed, taught that believers should be baptized. They had all been baptized as infants, but they now regarded this as unbiblical and ineffectual. So they wanted to be baptized as believers, as men and women who were freely choosing to become followers of Jesus and had counted the cost of discipleship. This more radical step would be very costly indeed. They might discount their baptism as infants, but in the eyes of the authorities, what they were considering was rebaptism, an offence punishable by death. Why did rebaptism attract such a harsh penalty? Because it struck at the heart of the Christendom system, challenged the idea of a territorial church to which all citizens belonged from birth, and threatened to divide the community. It was treasonous as well as unorthodox. Legislation enacted many centuries earlier to counter the threat of the Donatist movement in North Africa could be used against any who dared to be rebaptized. Claiming that this was baptism, not rebaptism, would be no defence. So this was not a step to be taken lightly. Nevertheless, after a time of heart-searching and fervent prayer, George Blaurock stood up and besought Conrad Grebel for God's sake to baptize him with the true Christian baptism upon his faith and knowledge. And when he knelt down with such a request and desire, Conrad baptized him. In these famous words, the Chronicle of the Hutterian Brethren reports the first recorded instance of believers' baptism in the Reformation era, and the start of what soon became known as the Anabaptist rebaptizing movement.
George Blaurock and Conrad Grebel were two of the early leaders of the Swiss Brethren, as the Anabaptists who originated in Zurich are often known. Grebel was the son of a city councillor who'd been a member of Zwingli's inner circle. Blaurock was a former Catholic priest. Other significant figures were Felix Manz, a biblical scholar and another of Zwingli's disciples, who was the first Anabaptist to be executed by the city authorities, drowned in the Limmat River. Simon Stumpf, pastor in the village of Hong, who incited his congregation to smash idolatrous images and statues in the parish church. Margaret Hottinger, a charismatic evangelist from Zolliken, imprisoned and eventually drowned for her faith, and Wilhelm Rüblin, pastor in the nearby town of Wittikon, who urged his parishioners to stop paying the tithe. The execution of Manz in January 1527, less than 2 years after the first baptisms, was intended to demonstrate that the city authorities would not tolerate this radical movement. Persecution followed the Anabaptists wherever they went. but the movement was already spreading beyond the city and taking root in the countryside, partly because the Zurich group were determined to evangelize elsewhere, and partly because Anabaptists deported from the city found themselves in the neighbouring towns and villages. In Zolliken, just outside Zurich, many were baptized amid scenes of deep conviction and spiritual revival, and Anabaptism flourished there despite arrests and imprisonments. Within months, the movement has spread east to St. Gall and Appenzell, west to Basel and Bern, and north to Hallau, Schaffhausen, and across the border in Catholic territory under the control of the Austrian Habsburgs to Waldshut. Already Waldshut was moving in the direction of reform under the leadership of Balthasar Hubmaier, a former Catholic priest, who had participated in the public debates in Zurich and who had become the foremost theologian in the Anabaptist movement. The city was also being drawn into the peasants' movement, supporting the peasants with supplies and troops. Grebel and Reublin visited Hubmaier several times, and on Easter Sunday 1525 Reublin baptized him. Hubmaier then baptized 300 others, and before long most of the citizens and many of the city councillors had been baptized, turning Waldshut, albeit briefly, into an Anabaptist city. There was popular support for Anabaptism also in Hallau and other cities sympathetic to the peasants, where most of the citizens were baptized by Reublin and his colleague Johannes Brotli. Here and elsewhere, the Anabaptist movement intersected with the peasants' movement, recognizing shared concerns and offering mutual support. Contrary to what many have suggested, Anabaptism in its earliest period was by no means separatist or withdrawn from society. But by the end of 1525 the peasants' movement had been destroyed, and the authorities were determined to snuff out any further threats, including Anabaptism. The prospect of more Anabaptist cities now seemed remote. Hubmaier, in his writings and in his future ministry in Nikolsburg in Moravia, seems not to have given up on this dream, but most Anabaptists realized that if they were to survive, their only course was to pursue their vision within separatist underground communities.
In February 1527, representatives of the scattered Anabaptist communities gathered in the village of Schleitheim. Out of their conversation came the Schleitheim Confession, 7 articles setting out the distinctive convictions of the Swiss Brethren. Not surprisingly, in light of the circumstances, these articles are decidedly separatist and uncompromising in tone. They are also thoroughly pacifist. This confession would be the rallying point for most Swiss Anabaptists, although some, including Hubmaier, dissented from some of its statements. Its probable author was Michael Sattler, a former prior of a monastery near Freiburg, who had become an Anabaptist leader during 1526. If it was dangerous being an Anabaptist, it was even more perilous being an Anabaptist leader. The authorities targeted the leaders, and few survived for long. Mantz and Grebel were already dead. Grebel died in 1526. Sattler was tortured and burned at the stake in Rottenburg in May 1527. Hubmaier was imprisoned in Vienna, tortured and burned alive in March 1528. Blaurock, who'd been evangelizing and pastoring in the Tyrol, was executed there in 1529. There were no safe places. Catholic and Protestant authorities alike imprisoned, fined, tortured and executed Anabaptists. Catholics usually burned them, Protestants beheaded or drowned them. Some Swiss Anabaptists survived by going underground, especially in remote rural and mountainous regions. A few congregations persist today, known as the Swiss Mennonites, but most eventually emigrated in search of refuge. Many fled east into Moravia, where they joined Anabaptists fleeing from other parts of Europe, but some travelled north or west into Germany and the Netherlands, evangelizing as they went. One colourful figure from Germany who seems to have encountered Anabaptism through Swiss missionaries was Margaret Helwart, who was repeatedly chained to her kitchen floor to prevent her from contaminating her neighbours with her Anabaptist views. In Germany and the Netherlands, emigrating Swiss brethren encountered other Anabaptist communities who were different from them and yet recognisably members of the same movement. But these territories offered no more than temporary respite, and the Swiss Brethren found freedom to practice their faith only when they eventually emigrated to Pennsylvania and other regions of North America. Most are now known as Mennonites, adopting the name given to Anabaptists in the Netherlands, although a split in the late 17th century resulted in a conservative faction taking the name Amish from their founder, Jacob Amann.